Hello, everybody, and thank you to join another Corenet Global Brazil webinar session. My name is Renato Fusaro, and I am the VP of Corenet in Brazil, and I will host this webinar. Today, the webinar will be in English to our speaker and to reach our global audience. Yes, we have a lot of people that was watching our webinars. So if it is your first time with Corenet Global is a no-profit corporate real estate association with executives in 48 countries who manage the real estate assets of large corporations. We have Corenet Global in Brazil since 2006, and the chapter promotes several events and webinars per year. You can follow us in the social media. You can follow us in the LinkedIn. You can follow us in the Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. All the webinars are after finish. It is recorded when we put in our channel in YouTube. You can follow us in our main website. And we do all the things here in Brazil, focus on our content, good content for our members, good networking, and based on the support we have for AT Von Hart, CBRE, BR Properties, Sila, and other silver sponsors. We have Grupo VG, ATEC, John Richards, Tishman, Guia de Rodas, and we have the people from Void that are doing our videos and all the media we have. And it's time to talk about the summits. The next one in Americas will be in Chicago. I will be there. A lot of Brazilians will be there. A lot of people from Latin will be there. We have a good surprise to you guys in the summits. And we are talking about how to see corporate real estate, HR, and IT continue to work together and better. A lot of great contents and network opportunities. The last one I was have like 3,000 people from several countries, leaders for corporate real estate worldwide. And you can go to the Corenet Global webpage and participate, okay? We are, let's say, back to normal. No, cell phone is ringing. We are back to normal, face-to-face, but keep the webinars. And the idea of the webinars is bringing international speakers to share great contents to us. We have a webinar scheduled until November. Stay tuned. Next webinar will be about an interesting concept. We just finish it, the fine tunings just to present to you guys. And we are planning to do a event face-to-face that will be, I think, in beginning of September with the Uber. So stay tuned and connect with us in the social media and our web page. So today I have the pleasure to talk with Daniel Davis, the workplace researcher from Hassell, to talk about a very, very interesting subject, elastic building. So Hassell team are leading international design practice with the studios in Australia, China, I think Asia, UK, and USA. So our friend Daniel, it is in USA. I think, if I remember, is New York, right? So
yeah.
They are focused on designing the world best places that people love it. And to be honest, today, Daniel, I love the motto, like design the best place that people love. So beautifully designed places can connect us, move us, inspire us. They have the power to turn the new normal of today into the new beautiful of tomorrow. I love this that I saw in the Hassell webpage. And we had a lot of webinars talking with the architects, tenants, corporate real estate executives. Now it's time to see the other side of the table. So the owners, the developers, what the guys must do to keep the building attractive to the tenants. Because after the COVID, people decide to go to the hybrid way to work. I am working today from my home, and sometimes yesterday I go into the office. So this is the new, let's say, new normal, if you can tell that. But just to like Daniel, you can present yourself, the company, and talk about what your study about the elastic building. That is very interesting.
Cool. Thank you for that introduction. I'll just bring up my slides here. Cool. Well, yeah, thanks everyone for joining. Today I'm going to talk about elasticity in office buildings. And I guess to sort of understand why we're talking about elasticity, just imagine for a second that you're a tenant and you're currently looking for office space. And basically there's so much uncertainty in the world right now. There's the pandemic, there's climate change, there's political unrest, and there's these big changes in how people are thinking about work and life and the workplace. And given that uncertainty, if you're a tenant looking for space, you probably don't want to sign like a fixed long-term lease. You want some flexibility, which is all well and good. But if you're a landlord and you've got this big fixed asset, which is this big building, the question becomes, how do I offer flexibility when the thing that I'm selling is sort of literally cast from concrete? And so that's the question that we're going to focus on today. And I'll just start by kind of quickly explaining how I became focused on this question. I'll go through a little bit on sort of why this question is important, and then we'll get into some solutions to it. So I work for this architecture firm, Hassell, as you heard there in the introduction. And yeah, we do a range of projects. Office buildings and fit outs are a really key part of our market. But really our work is focusing on creating these places that people love. And the firm itself, it started in Australia, but yeah, we've got people all over the world now, Asia, Europe, North America. You'll notice there on the map that there's this big blank spot in South America. Unfortunately, we haven't had a chance to do any work in Brazil or South America. So yeah, we're definitely open to it, but it's just not somewhere that we've done any work at this stage, unfortunately. And we do tons of different projects from stadiums to urban plans and malls, but really a large portion of our work is office buildings and office fit outs. And it's really those projects that I'm going to be talking about today. So we started looking into this question of flexibility because some of our clients, the ones that either own or develop office buildings, were coming to us during the pandemic and asking for advice on how to make the buildings more flexible. And kind of as you can imagine, like their tenants had been coming to them and asking like for more flexibility. And for these landlords and developers, it was really hard. They weren't co-working companies. They weren't in the business of flexibility. So they were just like, like we've got these big fixed assets. How do we make them more flexible? And to answer that question, we started by gathering a bunch of landlords together and workplace experts. And I basically just interviewed them, asking them about what strategies they were employing and what things are actually working in the market that actually improve the flexibility of these assets. And so at the end of that process, we kind of narrowed it down into the 6 most successful strategies, which I'm going to run through in this presentation. Before jumping into the solutions, I'll just pause really briefly to talk about this push flexibility. And I'll just kind of say up front here that I'm going to talk about flexibility from the tenant's perspective. And I'm going to do that because I think it's the tenant's perspective that's really important. The tenants, they have a ton of power in the market today. I actually saw a stat yesterday that was saying that there's a 15% vacancy rate in office buildings in London. So, like in that kind of market condition, tenants just have a ton of leverage. And I guess I'm not going to talk as much about landlords and how they're structuring things because in some ways it doesn't matter. In this type of market, the thing that really matters is understanding the tenant's needs and accommodating those needs.
Yeah, I give an example to you, Daniel. Like talk about Latin America. I saw this week regarding 26% of the vacant space for office space in Mexico City, 23% in Brazil, São Paulo.
Yeah.
So it's huge. So only because of the landlords now are like, and now what's happened? How we can create something that bring the tenants back to the office, and it is a challenge. That is a great challenge.
Yeah. That's something we're seeing globally as well. Like you're seeing it in New York, you're seeing it in Australia, Asia, like everywhere this kind of problem is existing.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess like if there's sort of any overarching takeaway from this presentation, it's really that this tenant's perspective matters, especially in this market, obviously given everything that's happening around the world at the moment. And when it comes to tenants, the one thing that every landlord I've spoken to has wanted to know is whether the current push for flexibility is a short-term need or a long-term change. And so in other words, is flexibility something that is sort of temporarily in demand because of COVID and because these tenants have a lot of leverage and necessarily kind of something that will go away with time? Or is flexibility more a kind of permanent change in the industry, something that's going to stick around with us well beyond the pandemic? And when you look at the evidence, I think it really points towards this being a long-term trend. And so I'll give a couple of examples of what makes this a long-term trend. The first thing that we need to understand is kind of what's motivating tenants to seek flexibility. And to really cut a long story short, they want flexibility because the business environment is uncertain. So if you imagine that you're a tenant and you don't know what the future holds, that uncertainty, it makes it hard to sign a long-term lease or to make long-term commitments. So flexibility is kind of the product of uncertainty. And obviously the pandemic has introduced a lot of uncertainty into the system. But even if that hadn't happened, we'd still be facing an uncertain business environment. And there's lots of ways that you can measure uncertainty. I've got a couple up on the slides here. But I guess one example up there that I found interesting is the one on the left from McKinsey. They're estimating that 800 million workers will be displaced by automation in the next decade. And I mean, hopefully that's not you or I that's getting displaced by automation, but honestly, it might be. Because automation is not just about like people in factories anymore. It's about the types of kind of white collar work that fills office buildings. And that's to say nothing of the impact that things like climate change will have on cities, the generational changes that are happening in the workforce at the moment, the increased internationalization and competitiveness of the business environment. So if you're a tenant, you would have been walking into this really uncertain business dynamic even without the pandemic. When you lay the pandemic on top of that, it just adds even more uncertainty, which I think is a really good indication to say that flexibility is likely here to stay. Another kind of point sort of pushing towards this need for flexibility is that, I guess before the pandemic, companies were already starting to seek out flexible solutions, and companies were often willing to pay a premium for these solutions that let them keep their options open. And a really good example of this is co-working. I used to run the research group at WeWork, which WeWork's got a couple of offices in Brazil, but if you're not familiar with it, it's a really large co-working company with kind of 200 or 300 offices all over the world. And I'll always remember the survey we did looking at why people chose to become a member of WeWork. And I mean, in the media, there's a lot of conversations about WeWork and it's got free beer, it's got cool couches, it's got a lot of community. But when we interviewed and surveyed people, the most important factor for joining WeWork was the location of the building. The second was price, and the third was lease flexibility. So all these kind of like really traditional real estate metrics.
Yeah, by the way, Daniel, yesterday I was in a WeWork office.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. They are very close to my office here in São Paulo.
Yeah.
And I take advantage to visit them. And based on some market information, market research, they are saying that they are already come back to the level of occupancy pre-pandemic. So it's pretty much they have a lot of offices here in São Paulo. Mexico City also it's a huge market for WeWork, and they told me that they are in very good shape in terms of occupancy, pretty much the same level they had in pre-pandemic. So it's very good news. And I think this is because a lot of companies are looking for the co-working as a great solution in terms of flexibility, because they already are ready to be used, then create some other solutions. Okay, you don't want to stay at home, we don't have an office space at home very well, or kids in the home, or a lot of things you can go to a co-working that will provide the flexibility we need, and you don't need to go to the central hub office space. So I think they are in good shape, and I believe that they are the future of the office space.
Yeah, they're kind of perfectly positioned for what's going on in the world right now. So yeah, it's interesting also that you're saying that WeWork's so big in Brazil and Mexico, because the stat that I've got up there is from Manhattan. And so Manhattan's the island in the middle of New York. And like, imagine all the companies that are in New York. Like, you've got banks, you've got universities, you've got all the tech companies. The UN's got all their offices here. And in just 10 years, WeWork has grown to be the largest occupier of space. So the company that kind of occupies the most office space in New York at the moment isn't one of these banks or tech companies. It's this flexible office provider called WeWork. And this push for flexibility is something that we're also seeing from employees. So every year at Hassell, we run a large global workplace survey to gauge people's attitudes to work. We just finished the one for this year. And in recent years, when you ask people where they want to work, you'll see in these surveys, and Hassell's, it comes up in the Hassell survey, but it comes up in other surveys. Some people will say that they want to work in the office. Some people say they want to work at home. There's a really large contingent of people that say that they want to work both at home and the office. And what I think is really interesting about that is that when you kind of dig into it, there are some people that have this genuine desire to work a couple of days at home and a couple of days in the office. But for a lot of the people answering these surveys, they kind of just don't know what the future holds. And so they're sort of hedging. They're saying, I want to work both at home and the office because I don't know which one of these is going to be better for me in the future. And they're kind of like these companies. They want the flexibility to deal with the uncertainty that they're facing in their work environment. And finally, I won't dwell on this too much because you'll know this a lot better than me, but tenants obviously have a lot of leverage in this market. It's manifesting in lots of different ways. Firstly, I think you're seeing a real kind of flight to quality. So good Class A buildings tend to be actually doing pretty well in this market. I'm talking particularly about New York at the moment, but like good buildings in New York are still leasing pretty well. Bad buildings are really suffering. The second thing that you're seeing is that tenants are using their position to win more concessions from landlords. And often in these negotiations, the thing that they're prizing is some degree of flexibility.
Yeah, imagining in Mexico City that you have a 23% of vacancy. Man, it's easy to make a flight to quality movement because most of the developers already understand that they must focus on amenities, location, a better building, and avoid to the tenants to spend money in some things that the landlord can provide. So this is something that make a lot of companies try again the flight to quality because the vacancy is so high.
Yeah, and so much leverage to do that. So yeah, I guess as I sort of mentioned in the introduction, I mean, the bulk of this presentation is going to be about these 6 strategies for adding flexibility to the buildings. And these strategies, they come from my conversations with landlords and tenant representatives on how they've been approaching it. I should really sort of say up front here that the people that I spoke to were mainly from America and Australia. So there's going to be a bit of bias there. Hopefully it's interesting for you to see what's happening internationally in terms of this. But I think these lessons are generally applicable sort of anywhere in the world.
Maybe all the countries that have a large CBD area is pretty much the same. It's pretty much the same.
Yeah. So yeah, the 6 strategies are kind of laid out here. And I think what I find kind of interesting when you lay out the 6 strategies is that it suggests that there's more to flexibility than just co-working or just offering shorter leases, that there's this real kind of constellation of things that you don't always think about as being part of the flexible offering, but in their totality, when you add them all together, they help to make these projects more elastic. So I'll just run through each one of these, all 6 of them, and then we can kind of jump into a discussion or whatever else you want to do. So I'll start with the most basic and obvious of the strategies and then kind of build into the more complex. So one strategy I'm sure that you're more than familiar with is adjusting the terms of the lease. And I know that this is straightforward stuff, but just got it in here for really the sense of completeness. Like tenants are adding in these provisions to either expand their leases, contract them, or exit their leases at certain times. And I won't dwell on this too much, other than to say that across the world, you're really seeing that average lease terms are shortening. And these are, again, different stats. Unfortunately, none of them are from South America, but I mean, one on the right there from London, that in 1996, the average lease term in London was just over 21 years. So really, really long leases. In 2018, the average lease was 5.5 years. So that's all pre-pandemic, dramatic shortening in what's happening in terms of leases.
It's a clear signal that the guys are looking for flexibility, right?
Yeah,
like here, Latin region is pretty much like a 10 years, 5 years lease terms, but see a lot of companies nowadays, even not good in terms of local tenant law, doing like 3 years or less lease terms, just because they prefer the flexibility.
Yeah, it's pretty common in Asia to see that sort of length as well. And I think in some ways it's bad because it doesn't give people a sense of ownership because they know that they might be changing over the space really quickly. Yeah, it's something that's happening at the moment. And I guess just to give like an example, this is an example from Australia of a project that I think's got a really interesting lease structure. So not just shortening the lease, but having a lot of kind of clauses and terms in the lease that are really interesting. So this is a section through the building. The building's called the Suncorp building, and the building itself is in Brisbane in Australia, which is kind of on the northeast coast. And you can see in this section that all the blue floors are owned or leased by Suncorp, and they essentially took 18 floors at the top of the building and 2 floors in the podium down the bottom. And in the contract, at kind of set intervals, they have provisions to shrink the lease. So all those floors that are in kind of like the lighter blue, those are floors that they can kind of jettison in their contract. And they also have a clause in it to expand if they need to. So you can see just underneath the light blue, it can kind of go down 2 floors if they need to. And the whole layout of those floors is actually designed with this expansion and contraction in mind. So the top floors, I kind of think of it as like a little escape capsule. Like it's a little self-contained, like 8 floors that even if the lower floors are missing from their lease, they have the right kind of proportion of meeting rooms, the right balance of office space, that it can be a self-contained office with no modification if the lower floors are let go. And the lower floors are all designed sort of almost as spec offices that they could be taken over pretty easily by another tenant if they needed to be let go. The other thing that you'll notice that's going on in the building is that lower down, there's a co-working space, and Suncorp has priority access to that. So they have a set kind of notice period where if they give notice to the landlord, they need to take over so many offices in the co-working space, they can do that, which is again another way for them to have some ability to kind of control how much space they're taking in this building. So all these kind of pieces together, that like ability to expand and contract their lease, and then also this ability to take over parts of the co-working space or access the co-working space as they need it, it gives Suncorp a lot of flexibility to scale up and scale down as they need. And of course, for the developer here, I think the real draw of this is, like they're landing a really big client in terms of an anchor tenant. And if an anchor tenant has all of this provision to scale up and scale down, they're not going to be wanting to leave anytime soon. So for both sides of this deal, Suncorp obviously got a lot in this deal, but the landlord is also getting a lot by offering this flexibility to them.
Yeah, we have here in Brazil some developer that do pretty much this one, that I like the idea to have a kind of a co-working location inside of the building that it is for the main tenant and all other tenants that are there say, hey, I have a project and I need a space for 6 months. Okay, we have that. So we don't need to go to another location for this project. So lease for 6 months or pay-per-use, something like that. So we have at least one that I know, good developer that are doing this. And probably in the future, a lot of them will follow this kind of flexible way to occupy the building, stuff like this.
Yeah. No, I really like that as a strategy, and yeah, I think it'll be really successful for them. So that's really cool to hear. So the second topic here is design, which is obviously a topic that I love. And when it comes to design, I think flexibility is actually a really interesting ingredient. And what I think is interesting about design is that you have to really get the balance right in terms of flexibility. If the design is too rigid, it's not going to be able to adapt to new uses. But at the same time, if you make a building too flexible, you kind of end up designing a space that essentially accommodates everyone, but suits no one. And that ends up feeling really generic, and it ends up like kind of lacking a distinct brand or identity, which again, negatively affects it. So I think the real skill of design here is both that you want to have some flexibility, but not too much flexibility in the design. And the challenge is really to find that balance. And I think when you think of like great buildings, like classic iconic buildings that really lasted the test of time, often what you find is that the building is flexible enough to suit a range of different tenants. They might have been designed 100 years ago, but it's still able to be adapted to a modern workplace. But it's also special enough to have its own brand and sense of identity. And so it has this kind of value to it, or this cachet that carries through despite that. So we've been doing a lot of research, going back even before I joined Hassell, looking at what makes buildings, particularly floor plates, flexible. And in that sort of studies, the things that we've really found is that there's kind of four main ingredients. The first is what we've called their adaptability. And so highly adaptable floor plates tend to be sort of large, regular, and contiguous. So not kind of like weirdly shaped floors with like redundant corners and alcoves and things like that. There's not a lot of kind of like wiggly bits going on. It's just like really simple squares and things like that that can be easily subdivided into different spaces or configured by different tenants to be different layouts for the building. The second thing there is simplicity. So even small things like the column spacing or how they align to mullions and things like that makes a really big difference in terms of how easy or how difficult it is to subdivide the space and how flexible the space is in terms of different uses. Obviously, usability is really important, particularly when thinking about how the floor is going to be split, where the corridors are going to go. You see some floor plans where it could be split, but you end up with a lot of corridor space joining those different spaces, and that makes a really inefficient floor plate. So what is that kind of lettable area going to look like after it's been subdivided? And the final thing is there is just the visibility of space. And I think it's really important, both the sort of efficiency of that subdivision, but also things like the size of the subdivision. So you don't necessarily want to have a really large subdivision beside a small one, because those two companies are going to be really different. You want to have sort of similar companies grouped together within the building in the way that it's subdivided.
Yeah, Daniel, just a question that comes here from the WhatsApp. The people say, this is pretty nice. It's a square. But you as a designer specialist, what is the right size, or if you have a kind of a range for the size of the floor to achieve all those four steps that you talk about, the visibility, everything that you told her, okay, the right size will be, I don't know, 2,000 square meters, 1,000, less, more, a square. If it will be a different kind of a layout or design of the building, how does it impact on this approach?
So I generally say that it depends a little bit on the tenant, and it depends a lot on the site condition. So you'll see some buildings where the site's constrained, or there's like shadows or stuff like that, where it's difficult to do particular things. But just as a general rule, I'd say the larger the floor plates, the better, up until the point where you inhibit sunlight coming into the building. So the thing that you're really looking at, I think, is like allowing enough sunlight into the building that even if these big deep floor plates are large, that there's still light coming into those spaces. So, I mean, it's not a precise answer because it's always really context specific, but just generally those are the kind of factors that we're looking at.
Yeah, and we have some buildings that have the air conditioning, elevators, everything in the middle. So in your example here, they are in the one of the sides. To me, looks like much better, right?
Yeah, so generally speaking, again, it depends on sort of the entrance to the building and how people at the ground level can get into the building and things like that. Sometimes it's not possible to put an elevator to the side, but if possible, put the elevator to the side because it opens up the space and makes it easier to divide. One exception to that is sometimes if you put the elevator to the side, you end up with little kind of alcoves on the corners, and those can be really hard to use. So you got to be thinking about sometimes in the corners a little bit better for the elevators, but generally in the middle on the side is the best space.
Got it.
Cool. So I'll just give an example of like how we use that strategy. And I know that we're kind of talking about these big square like floor plans, and they sound really boring, but this is a project that implements all of the things that we've been talking about, but puts it into a more interesting package. So this was for a technology company called Seek. So they're an Australian company. They do like job searches basically, or help you find a job. They're a job board. And this is their headquarters in Melbourne in Australia. And
can you put in the screen because we're not seeing the presentation?
Sorry. My presentation?
Yeah, now we are.
Okay, cool. Okay, yeah, so this is the company Seek, big project in Melbourne, and this is their headquarters. And they were really after a space that was sort of easy to be reconfigured. Like they're talking about sort of hackable or changeable space that can be reconfigured. And what I think is interesting about this building, and you can kind of see it in that diagram there, it consists of these two wings. Like there's the left one and the right one. And those two wings are joined by a staircase in the middle there. And the way that the building's set up, so Seek's the main tenant, they've taken the whole building. The way the building's set up, the core there is designed in such a way that if Seek wanted to give away half the building or the landlord wanted someone else to move in, one person can take over the building on the left, one person can take over the building on the right, and the core in the middle is actually accessible from either side so that they have a separate entrance. So it felt like they'd have a separate building. So the building itself, just at a big kind of scale, it's kind of two separate wings, and they can be subdivided into their own sort of separate thing and accessed in a completely different way. The floors themselves are these big rectangles. So you see there that there's kind of no columns in the middle of the floors. They're just held up by the structure on the outside. They're these big rectangles. And again, the core's in the middle of that building. And so the elevators, they're joined on exactly like in that diagram. They're joined onto the side of those rectangles, and the rectangles are just space that they can use however they want to use it. Because of the gable at the top, it creates this big kind of open atrium between those spaces, which is really nice as well. And probably another thing just worth talking about is that at the bottom of the building, they actually wanted to have the space reconfigured or be able to reconfigure it into a childcare center. So the entire ground floor is designed in such a way that currently Seek uses it as a big presentation space, but it's also designed in such a way that could be reconfigured into a childcare center if that's what they wanted to do in the future. So, I think what's interesting about this project to me, and you can kind of see it in that image of the two gables there peeking up above the trees, like it's a building that's got a really distinct identity. It's something that like is really recognizable. It's kind of iconic in the skyline, that this building with the two gables. But then when you get into like the nuts and bolts of it, it's this really like it's a bunch of rectangles stacked on top of each other. It's like, it's really like
one, right?
yeah. There's something really rational about it, but it's also like quite beautiful in its formation. So I think it's a good example of like kind of balancing that line between creating something that's flexible, but also creating something that's got its own brand and identity and is still distinct and still has a character to it without being too generic. So the third one here is to do with amenities. And again, this one's pretty straightforward. I guess what I think is interesting about amenities is that we often think about them in terms of employee perks. So like things that we add into the buildings to make tenants come into the building because it's a nice space to inhabit. I think another way to think about amenities is that it's a way for companies to outsource some of the functionality that they would typically have in their office to other parts of the base building, to the base building essentially. So really, I think, I know, like, to give a basic example of this, you can imagine like a law firm that's in a building. They often have a really fancy kitchen because they want to entertain guests. But if a building has a really nice restaurant or a couple of really nice restaurants in the podium, maybe that law firm doesn't need to build their kitchen. They can just get catering in through the elevator and order the food in for all the events that they hold. So you have this thing that would have typically been a CapEx cost for the law firm, where they would have built this really expensive kitchen, which would have been used a couple of times a week. They free up all of that space in the floor plan, and instead that space they can use whatever they want, and they turn it into an OpEx cost where they're paying the restaurant kind of on demand to use the restaurants. So we've done a lot of research into what amenities people want to have in buildings, and this is a survey that we run every year. This is the workplace survey that we do every year. And this year we asked people what amenities they want to see in their buildings that would get them back into the office. You see there at the very top, the most wanted feature of any office is free food. This comes up every year when we run the survey. And I think people, they're not just after a free lunch. I think they want to come to work because they want to spend time with other people. They want to break bread. They want to share a moment with their coworkers. And I think that's really what that's reflecting. Right below free food, you'll see that the next most popular things, which are highlighted in red there, are fresh air from outside and gardens and green spaces. And this, again, isn't that surprising. People have spent a lot of time indoors during the pandemic. And I think there's a natural connection that people have to wanting to spend more time outdoors as a result of that. Right below those two, the things that you kind of see a whole range of things that have to do with the home. And so that highlighted in blue there. So good coffee, space to focus, a gym, and space to take a nap. So we also ran the survey in Asia. And in Asia, it's more common to take siesta, say, after lunch and things like that. But I think in general, what those kind of four things reflect is that you have a lot of people that have spent a lot of time working at home. They're coming back into the office, and they're bringing with them, as they come back into the office, a lot of expectations around the work that that develop from working at home. So things like good coffee, a space to relax, like having space free of distractions. It's all something that people often could get at home, and they're taking those expectations with them back into the home environment.
Yeah, Daniel, we have a kind of a joke here in Brazil.
Yeah.
If the meeting don't have a food, could be a meal, We don't need to go. We have no food there. So people like this, and also because of, I think, this kind of a coffee space and everything is very cultural in some countries. That is, let's say, the most important space that people fight to keep. Even if you terminate part of the lease, the delivery floor, and say, "Oh, keep the coffee area. This is important. The coffee area it's huge. It's the core of the office space." And other reasons, like I said, no, it's not so important. But at least here in Latin, we see a lot of people that are fighting for coffee space, and free food, of course, would be great, but it's not common. But at least have our space to eat. Some countries get food from home and cooking inside of the office space. And other countries is much more common that we are get out for lunch, different than sometimes in the US, the people grab the lunch and sit at the table to eat. Some countries is pretty much, no, I need 1 hour outside of the office, so I go and eat outside of the building. So depend of the culture, but food, coffee, and a space to see the, let's say, to exercise the biophilia space, like the fresh air, garden. This is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. What you're just saying, it reminded me of like when I was at WeWork, we did some research on like how people eat lunch around the world. And so like in America, it was really common for people to eat lunch at their tables, but we also sent people down to Brazil and Argentina and Mexico to observe what was happening there. And yeah, the longest lunches of anywhere in the world, just a lot of people enjoying life. And
exactly. And I tell you, Daniel, you are more happy because of that.
Yeah, no, I think it's good.
More happy people because of that, because stay 1 hour outside of the office space, we're having a chance to know each other better, get more ideas, be more connected. But the coffee area must be there. So my friend Luis Esposel for Oracle, as I say, is very important to connectivity. Like here in Latin America, say, no, man, coffee area is very important. Please keep or create 1 or 2 more just to people be there and be more collaborative.
Yeah. So I guess just to give like one example of this, and again, we've all seen buildings with tons of amenities, but this is a project that we worked on recently in Brisbane, again, in Australia, in the northeast up there. The focus for this project was really about wellness. So it has sort of everything in it. A gym, a rooftop collaboration terrace, an auditorium, a 3-story podium with all these healthy eating options. And there's even an open air pool on top of the building, which is an amenity that I haven't really seen in a building before, particularly an office building. So yeah, it's just a nice project. And I think an example of how amenities that perhaps would have previously been parts of tenant fit out. So things like the collaboration space or the food spaces, that these are sort of migrating out of those spaces and into more of the base building, freeing the tenant up to have more space and to use the space more flexibly because they're not needing to provide those amenities within their tenancy.
Yeah, a question that comes from the WhatsApp here,
yeah,
Daniel. It's based on your experience. I try to translate in English. Like, based on our experience for design, is more common to have the amenities in the ground floor or first floor or rooftop. What is more common in Asia and in Australia, for instance?
Yeah, I think it depends a little bit on, I guess, the ground floor, the connection to the city. So
got it.
You are seeing in Australia in particular, I think, a lot of like sort of open ground floors that are almost like public spaces where people are coming and going, and not necessarily a lot of security or anything like that, very kind of free in how people move through them. It's not the same in places like America where there's often security at the front door and you can't get into the building unless you're like registered and things like that. So I really like that sort of attitude in Australia. And then there's, I guess, different sort of thoughts on things like outdoor space. So like outdoor space, if you put it too high in a building, it becomes really hard to use because it's too windy and the conditions aren't very nice. But if it's too low, then you don't get the views. So often it's a balance of kind of finding where in the building the best place to put those amenities are. And again, it depends a little bit on the context and like the quality of the view, the quality of the air and things like that in terms of where those end up. But yeah.
And the weather, right? So
yeah,
some countries like Brazil, the weather is great. So we can do this in a rooftop and nice.
Yeah.
In fact, the people love it when you go to a building and have some amenities in the rooftop. It's very good. But other countries with better weather are not, let's say London, less sun, I think is more difficult, right?
Yeah. We've done some rooftops in London, but yeah, it's not as nice as Brazil, I'm sure.
Got it.
So yeah, the fourth one here is co-working, and like we've all heard a lot about co-working recently. And as I mentioned earlier, with WeWork, a lot of the appeal for tenants is that co-working spaces are providing these like move-in ready spaces with these short-term leases. And I guess when it comes to co-working, probably one of the more interesting changes at the moment is changes to the business model. So in the real early days of co-working, I think it's pretty safe to say that landlords were fairly skeptical about co-working companies. And so most of the projects kind of operated on this tenancy model where the co-working company would basically come in and just be another tenant in the building. They would pay the landlord a check just like any other tenant, and they would manage and design the space themselves, and they'd be completely responsible for it. And so for the landlord, it was kind of hands off. Like, you come in, you lease the space, I don't really want to know what's happening there.
Yeah, this is the most common in most of the countries. You have some co-working company with the branding, and he is responsible for the lease and bring people. But we saw sometimes some landlords try to do this, at least in some cities that the co-workings are not there. I give you, for example, I visited a location in Uberlândia that the landlord create a kind of co-working just because they don't have Rework or Reduce or other kind of co-work companies there. So, and they like the idea, and the company is asking for that to have flexibility. So they create a kind of, let's say, in-source model that the landlord create your own co-working. So you know what? I don't need these guys. I can do it. But bring the real estate as a services.
Yeah. So that's something that we're seeing in Australia and the US and Asia as well. You can see on that slide there, like kind of 4 different models that these companies are using. So insourcing is definitely one model where some landlords are saying like, why are all these co-working companies making all this money, or we aren't able to attract a co-working company into this building? Why don't we just do it all ourselves? We can design the space, we'll brand it, we'll have complete control over it, and we'll also have all the kind of financial upside and downside that comes with managing the co-working company. We're also seeing companies like WeWork and other companies using more of these like partnership or outsourcing models. So in the partnership model, it might be a joint venture where the landlord's putting up some of the money to start with, the co-working company's putting up some of the money to start with, and they go in on it together where they share some of the cost of it, and they also share some of the risks, and they share some of the upsides. And another thing that we're seeing in Australia in particular is like the outsourcing model where a landlord might be like, we've got this space, we want to turn it into a co-working company. We don't necessarily want to do all the design and all of that. We'll just pay a co-working company to do that, but we'll pay them a fixed fee for all of that services, and we'll have complete control over it again for this kind of fixed fee. So those are kind of different models that we see emerging in the market at the moment as landlords, I think, get a little bit more adventurous in how they think about co-working.
Yeah, interesting.
And yeah, just to give, again, a little example of this, these are 2 co-working companies or co-working spaces that we did in Singapore, actually. And I think why I chose these ones is because they're really, I think, quite an elevated premium space. So you think of co-working as being kind of like cheap IKEA furniture, people just packed into spaces. And here you can see in Asia Square, you know, like really nice reception with a green wall and things like that. In the Capitol Tower, that room there, it's a room that they call the deal room. It's like a really nice bar in a co-working space. And it's the sort of space that other people in the building are able to come in and use. So meet with other people, bring clients into it, really elevate the kind of quality of that building by having that amenity within it, while also providing kind of flexibility to these tenants.
That's nice.
So this is the second last one, which is on-demand space. And you spoke about this a little bit earlier about some of these companies adding in these amenities that are used on demand. The way that I normally think about this is that in the sort of traditional lease, you have a company that's leasing space, say by the meter squared over a set period of time. It's probably months or years normally. In the co-working space, people actually aren't renting out space. They're typically renting out a desk in a co-working space, which has tons of amenities associated with it. And then renting that normally for months or maybe years. And then these on-demand amenities, they're more like kind of select amenities, like a meeting room, say, or a conference facility or a wellness space. that people are renting out, not necessarily even by the year or by the month, but often by the day or the hour, that are managed by the landlords in some manner.
Yeah, I love that idea.
Yeah. Yeah, so like this is kind of how it works, I guess, from the tenant's perspective, which is like you got your core lease within the space. That core lease is the thing that you're paying for the next couple of years. It's got like the workstations and all the kind of main workspaces in it. And then you have this sort of on-demand monthly spaces where things are flexing up and down. It might be co-working, it might be project spaces. And then there's on-demand spaces that maybe are daily or maybe hourly. And so the tenant has this ability, has a fixed kind of interest in the building, but there's also this ability to go up and down as needed based on what they kind of need. And again, just one example of this is a project space that we did for this company in Melbourne in Australia called Lendlease. And so for them, they had this building. So Lendlease is a developer, a property developer. And they had this space in this building where they had kind of 2 tenants in the building that were taking maybe 3 floors each. And then Lendlease had 3 floors, and they decided to reduce their tenancy down to 2 floors. So they had a floor left over, and they thought, why don't we try something different in this and see how it goes? So they designed this, or we designed for them this project space. And you can kind of see on the floor plan there, the floor plan is divided into 4 different zones. So each one of those zones is like a self-contained project space with like seating for maybe like 30 or 40 people, a couple of meeting rooms, and they open up into a communal kitchen area. And so if you're one of the tenants in that building, so one of the tenants in that building's engineering company called Arup. And so when Arup has like a big project on, they need to get a whole bunch of people together, they can rent out one of these project spaces for the next week or for the next month or for however long that project's going to last, pull everyone together into that one space, work together on it. And then when that project's done, they give away the space, it goes back to Lendlease, and they rent it out to the next person. Obviously, they're paying a premium to do that, but I think it's an interesting way of adding flexibility into the project where there is this kind of, like spec suite almost that people are coming in and out of. It's not quite a co-working space. It's very specific amenity, but giving this tenant, in this case, someone like Arup, a lot of flexibility in how they use the space without needing to go outside of that building.
So it's pretty much like a pay-per-use amenity area that you lease it if you need for something. That's a nice idea.
Yeah.
You can solve this sometimes, not amenities, but at least the co-working companies started with this when you talk about meeting rooms. It's pretty much the same concept, but now it's not only meeting rooms, it's pretty much like the amenities. I like it. Interesting.
Yeah. Meeting rooms are something you often see buildings now, like floors of meeting rooms that can be used in that way. And this is maybe another kind of exploration of that idea. Okay, this is the very final one, and it's about urban precincts. And I guess basically we put this in here because essentially there's only so much flexibility that you can get into a single building. And really, I think if you want to take things to the next level, you've got to think about how buildings are working together to create sort of comprehensive urban offerings. And we do this work with this research partner, Place Intelligence. So they do research where they study how people are moving through the cities, normally tracking cell phone data and things like that to understand what people are doing before and after they get to a building. And so they're trying to work out things like basic demographic information, like who are these people that are coming to the buildings? Where are they commuting from? But also questions like, what are they doing during lunch? Where do they go after work? And I think this is really useful data because if you know that many people in a building, say, live within cycling distance, it might be an indication that you need sort of end-of-trip facilities, things like showers and bike racks to let them come in that way. Or if you know that a group of people are, say, regularly traveling to an area in the city for lunch or for a yoga class, it might be an indication that there's demand for these amenities closer to your building and something that you can fold into that building or that precinct. So I think what's interesting about this is that you can use these types of urban analytics and start to see how your building interacts with the wider environment and identify amenities that might contribute not just to a single building, but to the wider community.
Yeah, if I understood well, Daniel is pretty much like instead you have one building with everything inside, is have a different buildings with different approaches or different uses, something like that, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Got it.
Yeah, so this is a project that has that at its core, which is Sky Central in London. So they're a TV company or a TV broadcaster over there. And we did the building Sky Central, which is the pink building on that campus. And the way that this building was designed is like Sky Central, it itself is kind of on the outskirts of London. So people that travel there, they get to work by bus normally. And once they're on that campus, it's quite hard for them to leave and go and do other things. So it's really self-contained. And the way that Sky Central was designed, it was designed to have some of the amenities that the other buildings didn't have. So you'll see some of the amenities on the campus are things like a hairdresser and nail salon, because they're a TV broadcaster and people have to look good for the cameras and things like that. But then things in the building itself, like an event space, a cinema for screening movies and things like that. So things that weren't on the campus itself, but that they needed access to, they put them all in that building. And that building then frees up all the other space in the other buildings and makes them more flexible through how it's utilized.
Yeah, it's a nice solution. Sometimes it's better than squeeze the things in the building to put other things, create another one with the specific use. Got it.
And finally, I'll just give a quick example of kind of a project that brings all this together, and then I'll just conclude it and we can get on to some questions.
Sure.
So yeah, this is Shaoxing Tower in China. And the kind of premise for this building was, rather than having all these separate buildings in the city that each have a single use, why don't you take all those uses, stack them on top of one another and put them into one building, or in this case, 2 different buildings. And so this is the tower itself. And on the right there is, I guess I'll start on the left. On the left is an office building. And there's a whole bunch of different amenities in that building that are designed to both attract tenants, but also make the building more flexible. Building's been designed in such a way, you'll see it kind of flares at the base and goes up. So, and that kind of, maybe this goes back to that earlier question about like floor plate sizes. And the floors down the bottom, which are larger, those are floors for things like stock trading and things like that require these big floors and maybe don't need as much light. And then up the top are more the kind of premium offices that rely more on the views. On the right there is actually a hotel. So those 2 buildings, again, kind of going back to the idea, like the precinct, like they work in concert with one another. So people are coming into the office building, they're flying in, they need to access it, they stay in the hotel, and then they go into the office building. And so those 2 things, they give each other an amenity that either one of them needs. The hotel, it's also got, the hotel, it's got the, some of the meeting rooms and some of the like conference facilities. So those are things that people in the building, in the office building, can use as well. So they kind of feed off one another.
Yeah, if you need more space to make meetings, you can use the hotel because it is just across the street or something like that.
Yeah. And then tons of green space and things like that. So yeah, I mean, it's a project that we've got kind of on the boards at the moment. I think it's just a really interesting example of kind of throwing all those things into one building and seeing what it can combine.
It's a beautiful location.
yeah, nice. It's nice.
This helped a lot, right?
Yeah, I'd love to visit it one day. So yeah, I guess just to wrap this all up, I think that when it comes to this kind of question of flexibility, I guess one thing that really kind of strikes me is that there's really not like a universal set of features that will make every building flexible. The best kind of answer, and again, like people kind of come to me at the end of these presentations, like what are the best amenities to put in, or what should I be doing to make a building flexible? And the answer is really that it depends, because each mode of flexibility appeals to a different customer segment. So a legal practice might not be likely to use a co-working space because they're concerned about privacy. But they would be open to flexible lease terms because they're into negotiating things like that. A tech company might want particular amenities to help, say, attract new employees. They might care about views or green spaces and things like that. And maybe a design firm cares about having things like on-demand spaces, like those big project rooms that we saw in the land lease project. And so each one of these amenities appeals to different kind of customer segments, basically. And I think if I've learned anything from doing this research, is that really just kind of underscoring the importance of knowing your market and your point of difference in that market and who it is that you're trying to attract in that building. I think you really need to start with these big kind of questions, like what exists in the market, what is your brand and point of difference, who are your target customers, what are their needs, and then build up from those big questions into these finer questions about which particular amenities or which particular design strategies make sense for your building. So it's really, I think, not a one-size-fits-all solution to flexibility. It's really about creating something that works in your specific market for your particular target tenant. So yeah, I guess if there's anything you're going to kind of take away from this, it would be to, I think, really know who your future tenants are of your buildings. Have some kind of strategy in place for thinking about flex and how you're going to accommodate that within the building, particularly given that it's going to be something that is increasingly going to be important going forward for all tenants. And then thinking about, I think, in particular, having some kind of space as a service offering, whether that's project rooms or co-working, whether you're doing it, whether you're outsourcing it, whatever it is, having some of that in the building as well. And the final thing that I'll note is that we've published some of this work in a white paper, which is on our website, hassellstudio.com. So if you want to read it kind of in more depth there. But yeah, I'm happy to take any questions that anyone has or anything else. But yeah, thanks for your time.
Yeah, Venu, thank you so much for all the content you bring to us. It's a lot of good ideas, a lot of things that we are, nowadays we're seeing a lot of requests for flexibility, and most of these come from the tenants. And good to know that you guys are studying how the landlords and owner developers can provide this flexibility. Some questions that was raised is what is your big challenge when you talk about the flexibility? More than convince owners to do that, right?
Yeah,
but
yeah.
In terms of design, what is the big challenge? It is much better, of course, do a building from the scratch, from the beginning. Great, of course, it's easy. But if you must to adapt a building that is a old-fashioned traditional building, what is the key elements that you must change, or what is the big challenge to achieve this flexibility, like elevators or any kind of the reception? Or because convince owners is difficult, developers to do this probably is not easy, but more than this is how you change the operation of the building to achieve that.
Yeah, so convincing the owners is hard, but I think it goes part and parcel, right? Like the hard part of it, I think, is the economics of it. Like it's very simple for an owner to look at a empty floor plan and be like, yeah, we can rent this out for that, and that's what the return on investment is going to be for this. If you start talking to them about, hey, we're going to put in a co-working space here, and like tenants are going to be able to come and go by the month, and like being able to account for that becomes really difficult for them. And that, I think, is a lot of the challenge. So then I guess this question of like retrofitting buildings is something that's coming up a lot at the moment. We were talking about that earlier on about like the vacancy rates and things like Mexico and other places, so you have these owners who have these older assets who maybe are struggling to lease them out because you have these other newer buildings in similar locations that have better amenities or whatever, nicer buildings. And so I think for those buildings, the things I mean, again, it depends a little bit on the building, but typically the things that we're looking at is the ground floor. So like if you've got a building that was designed in, say, the 70s or 80s, often things like retail is not open. There's a lot of opportunity there for kind of opening up those spaces and making them more vibrant and interesting, and also getting a little bit back on the kind of lease of that space. I think co-working is also another kind of obvious thing that can be added to some of those buildings that if there's empty space in that building, it's an obvious kind of use for it to increase the flexibility. And then I think the other thing that we're seeing at the moment is also companies looking at things like rooftops and things like that, and how they can incorporate additional amenities into buildings on top of kind of what's already there.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, Vaniel. So thank you so much for your time and to bring all this information to us and all the content. So we love the presentation and everything. I hope you can make some projects here in Brazil. So the idea to be, let's say, virtually in Brazil today is to share the knowledge you guys have and how you can bring something different for Latin America. We are eager for new types of building, new types of occupancy, new type of tenants, and the way to work it based on this flexibility. So thank you so much.
Yeah, cool.
And see you soon.
Sweet. Thanks a lot. Yeah, that was great. Thanks for all the questions, everyone.
So I will speak in Portuguese now with our team here, okay? Pessoal, muito obrigado pela participação em mais um webinar da Corenet. Fiquem ligados aí, na próxima semana a gente vai divulgar tanto eventos presenciais quanto o próximo webinar. E mais uma vez, obrigado pela audiência e boa noite e até a próxima.